All right, welcome back everyone for another deep dive. And this time we are tackling the show that everyone's been talking about, House of David, and specifically season 1, episode 2, Deep Calls to Deep.
Ooh, deep calls to deep.
I like that.
Yeah, it's a good one, isn't it? And we've got a great recap and analysis here by Kevin Keening to help us kind of pick this episode apart. And he does a really good job of weeding in the biblical source material. So for those who are familiar with the story of David, this will be really interesting for you.
Yeah, you know what I think is so cool about this show is how it takes these ancient stories and breathes new life into them. It's not just a retelling. It's like they're really trying to get inside the characters' heads. Like, what makes them tick? What are they afraid of? What are their motivations? Right from the get-go, you've got these two main storylines happening at the same time. You've got David and all that family drama going on, and his ambition is kind of starting to show. And then on the other hand, King Saul is really starting to lose it. His mental state is just deteriorating, and there's all this political intrigue happening at court. What do you think is the show setting these two storylines on a collision course here?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I mean, that parallel structure is definitely doing some heavy lifting.
Yeah.
It feels like they're setting up this huge clash between David, who's on the rise, and Saul, whose power is just fading away. And, speaking of David, that flashback to his childhood,
Hmm.
I mean, wow, talk about a way to introduce a character.
It's intense, right?
Really intense.
I mean, talk about a traumatic experience losing his mother. Like,
Yeah.
that Nitzaveh in such a horrifying way, it's no wonder he's driven to prove himself.
Right.
But I'm curious about the show's decision to include that specific scene with the lion. We all know that David goes on to slay Goliath, but this early encounter with the lion, I don't know, it just adds another dimension to him, don't you think?
Oh, for sure. I think it's a really smart way to show David's vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
Even heroes have these experiences that shape them, loss and grief. It's not all about the big heroic deeds. It's about what makes them who they are.
Yeah, and we see that theme of, these shaping influences play out in the political storyline as well. King Saul was once this powerful leader, so decisive, and now he's just consumed by paranoia and madness. It's frightening. I mean, that scene where Queen Ahinoam orders Abner to eliminate anyone that Samuel might anoint as the new king.
Chilling.
Chilling is the right word. And then Saul's terrifying attack on Ahinoam herself.
Whoa.
It's like the show is deliberately contrasting David's journey with Saul's downfall.
It's an interesting contrast, isn't it? And what about Anamam? What do you make of her character?
She's a tough one to figure out, isn't she? I mean, she's clearly a powerful woman in her own right, and she's obviously devoted to her husband, but she's also capable of some pretty shocking things to protect his throne. It makes you wonder about her motivations, like how far is she willing to go?
Yeah, does she have any limits? It's like she's balancing on this knife's edge between love and ambition.
Exactly. And then you have the introduction of Achish, the king of Gath. And he's got this ambition to unite all the Philistines against Saul. But what I found really interesting is his strategy. He's actively seeking out the Anakim, the giants, to lead his army.
Giants?
The giants.
Yeah, that was a smart move by the writers.
Right, because the Bible doesn't really explain how Goliath is connected to the Philistines, but by having Achish recruit these giants, it gives us a plausible backstory for Goliath, and it also kind of hints at the strategic threat that Achish poses. It's like they're taking these familiar elements from the story and weaving them together to make the world richer and the stakes even higher.
Totally. I think it's a really subtle but effective way to add to the biblical narrative without contradicting it. It makes you wonder what other creative liberties they'll take as the story goes on.
Right, like where are they going to go next?
Exactly.
It's not just the big plot points either. It's the little things they sprinkle in that make the world feel so real, like that scene where Saul finds Michal studying scripture. What do you think of that?
I like that it shows she's not just some princess. If she's smart, she's curious about her faith. It makes her a much more interesting character.
Yeah, you start to wonder what role she's going to play as the story unfolds. And speaking of those little details, I loved that scene with Saul giving Ahinoam the necklace. It's such a sad reminder of their past, back when things were simpler, before all the paranoia and the violence took over.
Yeah, it's really tragic. You can see how much he's lost his peace of mind, his connection with his wife. It's heartbreaking to watch.
He's trapped in this cycle of power and fear, can't break free. But it's interesting how the show also portrays those who seem powerless, like David's family in Bethlehem. Even they underestimate the people closest to them, like how David's brothers just dismiss him. They can't see his potential at all.
Yeah, there's this theme of underestimation that runs through the whole episode. Everybody's so caught up in their own ambitions and fears that they're blind to the people around them. Saul doesn't see Jonathan's potential. The people of Bethlehem don't see Nitzavit's wisdom and David's own family. They have no idea how courageous he is.
It makes you think, how often do we do that, in our own lives?
Right, exactly. And it ties into that other idea we were talking about, the tension between wanting things to be simple and that thirst for adventure. Saul's longing for the past, before he was king, before all the weight of the world was on his shoulders. And then you have David so full of energy and ambition, ready to prove himself. It's a classic dilemma, isn't it? That pull between security and wanting something more.
It is. We can all relate to that, can't we? That struggle between playing it safe and taking a risk going after what you want. And the show doesn't give you any easy answers, which is good.
No, it makes you think, makes you confront those questions right alongside the characters.
Mm.
Makes you think about your own choices and what you value.
And that fight scene between Eliab and the Philistines, oh man, talk about intense. I was on the edge of my seat.
Brutal, right? But I think it was a turning point for Eliab. Don't you think maybe this experience will change how he views his own ambitions?
Maybe it definitely showed a different side to him. He'd been so focused on proving himself, being the strong one, the fearless brother. But then when he's faced with the reality of war, you see this flash of vulnerability.
And David refusing to leave his brother behind, even though it meant putting himself in danger, that says a lot about his loyalty and his courage. I think the show's subtly setting up this contrast between Eliab, whose ambition seems to come from ego,
Hmm.
and David, whose courage comes from something deeper, a sense of responsibility.
It makes you think about how we define success and heroism. And, the show's portrayal of the Philistines is interesting, too. They're not just these faceless bad guys. You see their culture, their beliefs, their reasons for doing what they do. It's a lot more nuanced than we usually get.
Yeah, for sure. It challenges that whole good versus evil thing. It's a reminder that history is rarely black and white. There are always shades of gray.
And those shades of gray are what make the story so interesting. You can understand both sides, even if you're rooting for one over the other.
Exactly. It makes the conflict more complex, more human. It makes you question your own ideas about right and wrong. That's what good storytelling can do.
Speaking of good storytelling, we should probably mention that Keating did have a couple of criticisms of the episode. He felt that the flashback to David's childhood felt a little out of place, and that some of the injuries they showed were a bit over the top. Did that bother you?
I get what he's saying. The flashback might have had more impact if they'd put it in the first episode. And yeah, some of the injuries, especially Nitzevitz, they were pretty hard to believe. But overall, I think those are minor things in an otherwise great episode.
I agree. The good definitely outweighs the bad. So if we had to boil it all down, what are the key takeaways from this deep dive into House of David?
Well, I think it challenges us to look at our own biases. How often do we underestimate the people we're closest to? How do we balance that desire for comfort with our need to grow and take risks? Those are big questions, but they're worth asking. And House of David gives us a really interesting way to explore them. It also reminds us that history isn't just dates and battles. It's people's stories full of all those messy, complicated things that make us human, and that's why it still matters today.
That's a great way to put it. It's about connecting with these characters, understanding what they're going through, and seeing how their stories reflect our own. It really feels like House of David is doing something special here, taking these old stories and making them feel so relevant to our lives today.
I agree. I think it's because they're exploring these themes that are always relevant. Ambition, loyalty, faith, the way power can corrupt you, these ideas, they've been around forever. And House of David is giving us a new way to look at them.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm really struck by how they handle the whole idea of destiny. You see Nitzaveh having these visions of David's future. He's going to be great, but does that mean his path is already set? Or can he choose a different way? What do you think?
That is a good question. It seems like the show is playing with this idea that even if there is such a thing as destiny, you still have choices to make.
Hmm.
David might be destined for great things, but how he gets there, what he does along the way, that's all up to him.
It makes you wonder, right? What if he goes against what's supposed to happen? Could he break free from all the violence and be a different kind of king? Or is he just going to repeat the mistakes everyone else has made?
Those are some big questions, and I'm really curious to see how the show answers them. But it's interesting how that idea of destiny connects back to the themes we've been talking about. If David is meant to be great, does that make his ambition okay? Does it excuse the things he might have to do to get there?
That's a tough one. It makes you think about the price of ambition. What you might have to sacrifice to achieve something great. And speaking of sacrifice, the show doesn't shy away from how harsh life was back then. All the violence, the political games, the constant threat of war. It reminds you that even if you're destined for greatness, you still live in a dangerous world.
And that danger can come from anywhere. We've talked about the Philistines, but what about the problems within Israel itself? Saul's losing it, and that's tearing the kingdom apart from the inside.
You're right. It's like the biggest threat to David might not be some outside enemy, it might be his own people, the ones he's supposed to lead. How do you prepare for that?
That's what makes his story so interesting. He's got all these challenges, external enemies, internal conflicts, his own doubts and ambitions. It shows that leadership is never easy. It takes strength, wisdom, and knowing how to deal with really complicated and dangerous situations.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I keep thinking about how well House of David brings together history and drama and all these thought-provoking themes. It's not just retelling a story, it's making us think about human nature, the choices we make, and what happens because of those choices.
You said it perfectly, and I think it leaves us with a lot to think about. What does it really mean to be destined for greatness?
Mm.
Can you have power without letting it corrupt you? What are we willing to sacrifice to achieve our goals? Those are questions we can keep thinking about long after the episode is over.
Absolutely. And remember, this is just our take on House of David. We want to hear what you think about the show, the themes we've discussed, all the questions it raises, what stood out to you, what surprised you, what do you want to see happen next?
This deep dive has been a blast, and we hope it's made you curious about House of David and all the timeless ideas it explores. Thanks for joining us.